Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is the author of the novel Thomas Rising, no other than Mr. Justin Germain.
Thank
Welcome
you. Good to
to
be here.
Yes, welcome to Book 101, Mr. Justin. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Daniel. I so again, my name is Justin Germain. I am a Greek and Latin professor by trade. I teach the ancient languages of the ancient world. I also happen to be a huge fan of some of the epics of the Greco Roman world. Very much sort of grew up as a child of the 80s. I'm 43, just turned 43 last month. And so I grew up on He Man and the Masters of the Universe. I grew up
Yes.
on Conan the Barbarian and the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie and a lot of the short stories of Robert E. Howard. Of course, Star Wars has its place in my childhood, and a lot of these, IPs that are going to be fairly known to probably a lot of people and a lot of your listeners and viewers. All of which help inspire this my first rendezvous, my first adventure in fiction. I've published a little bit of nonfiction in the past, again, being in the academic world. This is my first fiction book. It is Sigma Book One, Thumos Rising is the subtitle there. And this is going to be the first in an ongoing fantasy sci fi series. And I'm just very excited to be talking with you today and really happy to be here and have an opportunity to talk about myself and the book.
Mr. Germain or Justin Germain, thank you so much for sharing your talents to the world. I hope you will be my tutor in Latin.
If you ever need one, give me a call. Sure.
For sure. So, what is the premise of Thermos Rising?
So, the way I give my sort of elevator pitch, this is effectively a Superman story. So, again, any listeners or viewers, they're very familiar with obviously the Superman character, arguably the most popular of all the comic book franchises in respect to just total longevity, right? I mean, you could argue maybe now Avengers is a little more popular, maybe at times Batman, but if you think about it, those Superman comics and stories were really kind of the thing that sort of set comics um, in the direction that we know today. Likewise, in respect to some of the big superhero movies, now that first Superman film was very successful and it was one of the ones that allowed things like the Avengers and to be made. So the concept for this book was very very simple. Again, very much inspired by He-Man, who was also a Superman adjacent character. At least I would consider him to be such. It is a character with those sort of god level powers, right? Infinitely durable, infinitely strong, infinitely fast, having to deal with what he should do living in the world with human beings, living in the gray area. What are the limits of his powers? What are the extents of his powers? Are there times where he should step back and not use his powers? And having to do this in a what we would think of as traditional fantasy slash sci-fi world. So it's Superman, but it's Superman with dragons and with sorcerers and with knights in shining armor. It's Superman with zombies and Superman with spaceships and Superman with advanced technology, the kind of things you'd see in Star Wars or Dune. And you all just get to see how some of these tropes interact with each other. And again, I think the final result was something that most readers are going to be fairly intrigued by.
Human of the Master of the Universe. Do you have a tagline of that in Thermos Rising?
Right, right, right. Yeah, and then so again, being a Latin and Greek professor, my studies have heavily influenced my writing, obviously. So for the actual title, Sigma, again, there's a bit of a play there. I mean, again, that is the Greek letter that would be the English equivalent of an S. So again, just like Superman has the S, this would be sort of the S in my world, right? At the same time, that's also the first letter of the Greek word Sophia, which means wisdom. And the book, in some ways, is also sort of the A story is sort of Superman with dragons and spaceships. But the B story, so to speak, and I think all great books sort of have an A story and a B story. There's what it's about, like if you read the back cover, but then there's really kind of the heart of it and what it's trying to get to, the lessons it's trying to teach. That's the power of stories that they teach. They do teach lessons in a very profound way. The B story is very much an allegory for Stoicism because our character, and again, if the viewers can see the picture of the website, that's my main protagonist, Zeno. And as powerful as he is, and for all the wonderful and amazing things he can do, there's also so much that he can't do. And of course, the irony is the more powerful he gets, the more he wishes he had more power so he could do more good for more people, right? So, at any rate, yes, Superman, but also the Greek word Sophia playing into that. And then thumos is actually a Greek word, very hard to translate that into one word in English, but it would mean something like soul, character. You could translate it as ego or narcissism. You could also translate it as rage or passion. It very much depends on the context that's being used, how you translate it. But thumos seems to be in traditional Greek literature that special it inside the human being, inside the human soul, that gets you to overcome great obstacles to achieve great goals, either for the good or perhaps for the ill, in some cases, of the greater society.
What are your struggles in writing Thuma's Rising?
So, oh, that's a good question. So, if anyone knows the name Stephen Pressfield, he's the author of Gates of Fire, The Legend of Bagger Vance, and more recently his nonfiction work, The War on Art. That's really kind of a how-to book, not so much on how to write, but how to become a writer. And the way or the reason I like to make that distinction, Daniel, playing directly into your question, he talks about this concept of resistance, right? You have this story, or again, maybe it's not just writing, maybe you're a visual artist, maybe you're a podcaster, a YouTube, I mean, whatever your creative outlet is, there's this resistance, right? And it morphs at different times. Sometimes it tells you, hey, this project is really too big for you to bite off. Maybe you should leave that to someone more adept at the task. Sometimes it's, listen, I I'm tired. I'd like to go to bed, maybe veg out watching Netflix or scrolling on YouTube for a little while. But you really need to put it in about an hour and a half writing or working on whatever the craft is. Whatever that resistance, however it manifests, I would say it's probably common to all creatives. And it's probably the thing that I struggled with the most. And it's funny, you would think after you've written a book and kind of gone through this process once, you might sort of have it licked, right? But it never it never gets any easier. It also never gets any harder too, right? Which I guess is the good news. I mean, even now I'm working on book 3 and the rewrites on book 2 in the series. And there are still days where I'm like, man, I could really just, just veg out for a while. But there's something deep within you, again, sort of throwing back to the title itself, maybe that thumos that, and at least in my case, really calls me to keep working on it, even when it gets hard. So that's been my greatest challenge. But overcoming that resistance has also been my greatest reward.
What internal or external conflicts does the protagonist face in Thuma's Rising?
So the external, again, very much the A story. That's a very easy, straightforward answer. Zeno finds himself in a world that is being ruled by an alien vampiric overlord, and the antagonist in the series, or at least in the first several books, is this character. You don't really get a name for him, but he's just known as the vampire, and he shows up about 14 years before the book opens up and just completely wrecks the entire world. In Zeno's case, really destroys the only family that he has. However, as he grows up and as he matures from a young boy, a young man, and then ultimately into a man, he realizes that his longtime best friend, whom he thought was dead, and his love interest in the book is actually not only still alive, but fighting a rebellion against the vampire. And of course, there's no way she's going to be able to win this unless she has some kind of supernatural aid of her own. And Zeno, again, very much like He-Man slash Prince Adam, at the beginning of the story, he's in his Prince Adam phase, where he's again a very competent, a very skilled warrior, but he's not a demigod. He isn't a superhero, for lack of a better term. But he finds out in the process of the story that he's actually an heir to a very ancient and primordial power, created by the people who spent eons fighting the vampire and his kind across the far reaches of space. And so when he accepts that power, he becomes the vessel of Thumos, and he is granted all of these incredible abilities. So that's his external struggles, right? He accepts this power primarily to protect his friend and his love interest, Alexandra. However, really the heart of the story, as I sort of hinted to earlier, is how is he supposed to use this power? And ultimately, is it possible for a human to be giving these semi divine powers, these semi divine abilities, and still hold on to their humanity? Does it just become the case that when you start to see the God's eye view from a million miles out, and you just see billions of lives on a given planet, is it true that the individual life loses some value? And for the greater good, perhaps, maybe you say some sacrifices have to be made in a very Machiavellian sense. Or does he hang on to his core principles as a human, clinging to the value and the dignity, inherent dignity of all human life? That's very much a struggle, and that's the maturity process that he has to go through, right? Going from thesis to antithesis, and then finally to synthesis in the final couple books of the series.
Very well said, Mister. Very well said. So, are there any significant antagonists and how they challenge the hero?
So again, the main antagonist is the vampire character, and again, there's a lot of books out there, obviously, with vampires as either the antagonist or the protagonist. It could be horror, could be fantasy, could be romantasy, could be dark fantasy. Again, lots of different genres play with these characters and with these creatures. I want to do a couple things here. With my vampire, one, I wanted to make the concept of a vampire truly scary again, and I wanted to see what would it be like for a creature, an entity that actually had some of the powers that are traditionally associated with vampires. How would they actually function, and how powerful, how dangerous could they actually be, not just to the individual, but for the entire human race? And again, the book puts forward the answer that quite dangerous. Such an individual could absolutely rule and conquer the world if they so wished. Now, I do play with the vampire mythology a little bit. Again, this is not set up in any. It's a fantasy world, right? So you don't have, Christianity. So you don't have like crucifixes and holy water, those kind of things. Again, he's an alien that just happens to need Homo sapien blood to survive. He's not created through some magic or a curse, so things like sunlight or anything like that are not going to hurt him at all. The real push in respect to Zeno, again, if I might make a comparison between Batman and the Joker, right? Maybe looking at it from a broader view, you might say, well, Batman is this highly trained martial artist, and he's got all these cool gadgets, and he's got all this know-how of how to be a vigilante, and the Joker just seems to be kind of this crazy guy. How can the Joker possibly compete with Batman? And of course, the answer is the Joker is willing to go to places psychologically, morally, that Batman is just not willing to go to, right? And that's the tension between the characters. And there's a lot of that happening here. While Zeno is, in principle, more powerful than his antagonist, than the villain of the story, the vampire is completely Machiavellian. He's psychopathic. a Machiavellian. He's a well, he's not completely a narcissist. He has a lot of those what you might refer to now as dark triad traits. Yeah, and so because of that, he is willing to do things just isn't willing to do. And there's a great sort of scene in the book that captures this when the two finally meet, kind of in the beginning of the third act, face to face. The vampire tells Zeno something to the effect of how noble it is that you're willing to die to set others free, and how useless that's going to be considering the fact that I'm willing to die just to destroy them. And what gods can you pray to for deliverance, seeing how it's so much easier to destroy than to save? And so that's the tension here. Even though Zeno's more powerful, the the responsibilities for him, the moral markers for him are so much higher. Whereas the vampire, his view is, even if Zeno kills me and destroys me and thwarts all my plans, if he loses his humanity, if he gives in to these very godlike powers and loses touch, if he in effect becomes the monster in order to kill the monster, well, the vampire wins that as well.
So, can you tell us the research process of Thuma's Rising?
Yeah, so it's funny you talk about research. In one ways, I think this is one of the advantages to writing a fantasy world in a sci-fi world, and that it's not, if you're going to write To Kill a Mockingbird, right? If you're going to write some, novel set in a real, grounded in a real place and time on planet Earth, again, you've got to know what that culture, what that language, what life was like in that little corner of the planet. The nice thing about fantasy is you just really make it up as you go. Now, there's a trade-off there. It must all be consistent. If it's not consistent, I find generally speaking, readers aren't very forgiving of that. Now, of course, there's an artistic argument to be had of soft world building, something a la Lord of the Rings versus maybe, or I'm sorry, a la Spirited Away, some of the Studio Ghibli films versus Lord of the Rings, which was more of a hard world building mindset. But the thing about it is everything has to make sense. And especially for me, I wanted this fantasy world to be very grounded in reality. So the history had to make sense, the biology, the chemistry, all those things had to make sense. And I can't tell you, Daniel, there were so many times that I found myself Googling the most random things. For example, how do squids reproduce? And what do you call the part of a spider where the the web comes out of? I had no idea until I had to Google it because I had to write this for a particular scene in one of the books. And so there's all kinds of these sort of little research projects that you find yourself jumping down the rabbit hole on. That said, again, it's a very different type of research than saying you're going to write a story about the Cold War, set in the Cold War in St. Petersburg, and having to go in and like do all this research into what it was like to live in the Soviet Union during that time.
So, Mr. Justin, what is your advice for those aspiring writers out there want to write the same genre as Thuma's Rising?
Yeah, I would say, again, the most important thing is just to get the thing written. Even if you don't think what you're writing right now is good, you can't go back and edit a scene or a chapter that doesn't exist. So just set very small goals. Say, okay, every day, or maybe depending on people's lifestyles, people get busy, right? I mean, again, I have a full time job. I mean, most people do. I have a beautiful 6-year-old daughter. People are parents, people have marriages, other commitments. But find yourself sometime per day, sometime per week to just sit down and just do the process of writing. And I think once you get that first draft done, again, I mean, that's just the beginning. There's a lot more work to do. But I just know in my case, I just felt so accomplished once the first draft was done. I mean, it felt like I was a real writer for the first time. So I would say that's the most important thing. And it doesn't matter how you feel about it. If you don't feel like writing, write. If you do feel like writing, write more.
Yes.
Again, show up like it's your job. Show up like you're getting paid to do it. That's part of what it means, um, again, to be a professional writer before you ever make 1 cent with any of your books, you've got to show up and do the work like it's your job, right? And again, I guess borrowing from Stephen Pressfield, he's got this great quote: put your butt where your heart wants to be. And if where your heart wants to be is writing and creating, whether it's in this genre or any genre, you just got to do the work. I guess the other thing, specifically for fantasy or sci-fi, I would say be a fan of some book series, some storyline, some character, some comics that really inspires you. Don't feel overwhelmed if you're not a fan or haven't read everything. That's okay, right? It's better to love one or two things and just really like a bunch of things, I think, in this. And also, don't be afraid to start mixing things around and playing with it. In many ways, Daniel, this book actually started out as He Man fanfic that I kept working on and working on. And eventually I decided, okay, well, I'm going to try to just publish this and I'm going to completely break away from the He Man names and storyline and mythology and just try to make it my own. But the reason why I wrote it is I went to a Barnes and Noble looking for a He-Man book as an adult that, I wanted to read. I mean, you do this with Star Wars and Star Trek, X-Men, a lot of these more popular IPs. You go to Barnes and Noble, you can just get a novelization, right, of these characters that you loved, right, growing up. I was looking for that for He-Man. I couldn't find it. And so I said, okay, well, I'm just going to write the He-Man story that I would want to read as an adult. And that is ultimately what turned into Thumos Rising. And again, it can be it's easy to second guess yourself to think, well, maybe there's not enough here, or who am I to sort of mess with these stories and these characters? But I think you just have to trust yourself and give yourself the permission to experiment with it.
So, Mr. Justin, what is your short-term and long-term goals in writing?
Well, short term is I want to finish editing book 2. I submitted it to the editor in September, and they came back with some suggestions, some rewrites. I well, I was gonna say I'm ashamed to say, but that's not entirely true. I'm not ashamed. It's just it's taking a little bit longer to get through those than I would have initially liked. One thing I'm also learning, I guess, just kind of a side note, Daniel, is it's okay to take your time. And even the my editor, and I had a phenomenal editor. You're definitely going to need a good editor if you want to write anything and publish it and have it sell. But it's okay to take your time with things. It doesn't. You don't have to put out a new book every year or even every 18 months, right? I mean, go with what is a sustainable pace for you. But to get back to your question, I want to finish the edits on book 2, get those back to the editor, and then I want to finish book 3, which I'm in the process of writing now. Long-term goals, I want to finish this series, and again, the writing market, novelization, this is a very competitive field. There is a lot of product out there and it's hard to get attention. I mean, I am having to basically give myself something like a master's class in advertising. Right. And again, my publisher, Atmosphere Press, was great. They put me in front of a lot of eyes, but that only goes so far. At the end of the day, I think as an author, not every author that puts themselves out there is going to sell, but every author that sells puts themselves out there and puts work into advertising, probably equal to what you're doing for writing, to be honest, right? So, so anyway, yeah, all that to say, of course, I want the books to continue to sell, but regardless of whether I make, whether I end up being the next George R. R. Martin, or if I never make another dime on any of these books, I'm going to finish the series. That's my long term goal. At this point, Daniel, I am really in love with these characters. Zeno feels like a very good friend and somebody that I owe a resolution to his story. Many of the other characters that have made great sacrifices through the course of both book 1 and later on in the series, right? I owe it to them to finish the job. And even the villains, even the antagonist, even the vampire, right? I mean, he surprises me every day with some of his some of his scenes. And you get to a certain point, these characters, in many ways, kind of write themselves. So the long term goal is to finish the series, and then I've got some ideas for some other series, some spin off series. But first, I've got to get through this. This is book one, and there's going to be 7 of these. So we'll get them out eventually.
Good luck for your goals, Mr. Justin, and thank you so much for sharing your talents to the world once again. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your book or your upcoming projects?
Yeah, thanks so much, Daniel. So you can find Sigma Book One Thumos Rising on Amazon. Just type Thumos Rising in the search, spelled just like it sounds. I'm Demetrios Lopez. That's the pen name that I use. You can find my website, demetrioslopez.com, all one word. You can also find me on Instagram or TikTok. TikTok. Also, just search Demetrios Lopez. And again, I'm very active with the fan community. If you reach out to me, um, I virtually guarantee you I'm going to get back to you. It may take some time, but I'm going to get back to you. It's really important. So, and I'm anxious to hear what people think about the book, and I'm anxious to engage with the audience about the books.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Justin Germain or Aka Demetrius
Lopez, right?
Lopez.
Yeah.
Because if you support him, more books like this to come. So, Mr. Justin, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate you guys.
More to come, people. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye for now, Mr. Justin, and look